Morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to our panelists and all the participants who have joined us today. It's great to see that so many of us are here for this webinar today. My name is Linda Fick, and I'm the Managing Editor of the South African Journal of Science, which, for those of you who don't know, is a multidisciplinary science journal published by the Academy of Science of South Africa. And we are here today because this week is Global Peer Review Week, which is an annual event that celebrates the essential role that peer review plays in maintaining quality of the literature. Peer review, as we know, is a reciprocal process, and having a peer review week gives us an opportunity to showcase the work of those involved and to thank them, the publishers and the editors, but most especially the peer reviewers, who often, because of anonymous peer review, don't get recognized for the valuable contribution that they make. The theme of this year's Peer Review Week is Identity in Peer Review, and today's webinar is entitled Behind the Scenes of Peer Review from the Perspectives of the Role Players, who are our panel members today and whom I will introduce before they speak. This is a webinar format, so please submit your questions for the panelists in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. We will have the presentations by our panel members first, followed by a panel discussion, and then an audience Q&A. If we've allocated ample time to the questions in anticipation that you will have lots of questions for our panel members. But if we don't have that many questions, then obviously we will just shorten that session. Please note that as a webinar format, the audience will not be able to switch on their mics or videos. So again, post your questions in the Q&A box. And please also note that the webinar is being recorded. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Professor Leslie Swartz. Leslie is the Editor-in-Chief of the South African Journal of Science. One of his other day jobs is a clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at Stellenbosch University. His research is on disability rights and access, with a focus on Southern Africa and on mental health issues. He's interested in the development of academic writing skills and in increasing participation of African scientists in scientific writing globally, and I'm going to put words in his mouth and add that I'm sure he's interested in increasing participation of African scientists in peer review globally as well. So thank you, Leslie, and off to you.
Thank you so much. Right, I'm just trying to share my screen. Can you see my screen? Yeah. Okay. No. Thank you. Thanks very much, Linda. Linda is the managing editor of the journal, and I have to say, having started in January this year, I'm incredibly lucky to be working with the team that I do work with, and somehow or another, I realized today that Linda had managed to weasel out of being a formal speaker in this meeting. She, in fact, knows much more about the process than I do. So thank you very much, Linda, and thank you very much for managing the process. Linda's role, though, I guess, is not formally as part of peer review, but she manages all the copy editing, the putting of the journal together, which we're currently finalizing with the current issue, and does a huge amount of work in addition to having a lot of institutional expertise. And for my first slide, I've put up this rather wonderful graphic, which Henriette Wagner and Linda developed, which shows a really lovely flowchart of the peer review process at our journal, and gives a good overview. And as you'll hear, although I'm the editor-in-chief, my role in this process is relatively small in some ways, and very much dependent on what other people uh, contribute. So it's my job to speak to you about peer review from my perspective. So, what is an editor-in-chief? It's a part-time appointment, and there are multiple aspects to my role. I went back and had a look at what was said when the advertisement went out for my position, and here are some aspects that are relevant to today. My role is to oversee the functioning of the journal, to strategize about future developments and scope, to take overall responsibility for the quality and integrity of the peer review process, so the buck in some senses stops with me, and to ensure that the journal lives up to its vision and mission. And I just wanted to mention that webinars like this, in addition to what we do in the journal, are part of how we see our vision and mission. But we are a very particular journal, and our vision is to publish and promote. And all the emphases I've put here are mine, but these are you'll find this on our website. To promote the widest diversity of excellent South African research for local and global academic community, and to inform policymakers and the public. And our journal, luckily for us, is open access. It's multidisciplinary, and this is something I'm going to come back to. And our objective is to promote the visibility and impact of South African and African research by publishing high quality original research. And this research has to be of interest to readers in any discipline and for the benefit of scholars, educators, the general public, and policymakers. So this is already telling us something about what happens in the process of peer review. We have to make decisions about peer review, and part of my job as editor-in-chief is to screen all the submissions that we have that come into the journal. And the very first job, and one of the biggest jobs that I have, is a rather horrible job, but a very important job in any journal, which is what is known as desk rejection. So this is rejection of manuscripts before they actually get into the formal peer review process. Our journal, like many journals, it's an increasing issue, has very, very high rejection rates. I think our latest data suggests 92%. And there are a number of reasons why we desk reject. Probably the most prominent of these is we get a number of submissions that are not in the scope of our journal. So every week we get submissions that are not from African scholars or are not on issues that are particular to the African continent. So geography is a very big reason for rejection. More tricky for us is the question of when is something too specialized. As I mentioned previously, we have a multidisciplinary audience, and so we have to make a determination, and I often make this determination of this is just too specific. So it might be excellent, it might be from Africa, but very few of our readers will understand it because it's a particular aspect of microbiology or engineering or social science or whatever. So sometimes this work is very, very competent, but very of very limited disciplinary interest or very small scope, which is really out of the range of our mission for a very widely used journal. More tricky than the scope issue in some ways is the question of quality, and I have to be the first screen in terms of quality. Even though I'm not a subject expert, and I'll come to this, it is often quite easy to see when methods are exceptionally weak. One of the particular areas that we get quite a lot of review articles where there is no particular methodology for approaching reviews, and we won't accept those. It's often quite easy to see, even if you're not a subject expert, that the logic of the argument is clearly flawed. Often the conclusions have no relationship to the finding. More tricky than that, because we're well aware that the majority of both the readers and the writers for our journal are not first language English. We have to make an assessment of the quality of the writing. And this is not just second language issues, but it's questions where the argument is very, very difficult to follow. We also have a number of concerns around originality, and I know that Nadia is going to be talking more about that. There's originality issues in relation to plagiarism, but also to the question of, is this something which we've seen before in our journal, or that everybody knows already, because we have so many submissions and we can only take relatively few. There's another category of desk rejection, which I call probable desk rejection. I personally have my own background, my own scientific background, but I'm often, because I'm not an expert in all these other sciences, I'm not fully competent to assess the quality and originality of a particular submission. So what I do is I refer to the relevant associate editor, and you're going to be hearing from one of them later, with my comments and my concerns. And I'll say to the associate editor, or I'll say to Nadia, in fact, I don't think this is right for our journal, but I'm not 100% sure. Teresa, what do you think? And Teresa will take a look, and I'll generally go with the decision of the associate editor. But also, I will also have to consider that every associate editor has their own particular area. So I also have to consider, if that associate editor says, no, this isn't appropriate to the journal, they don't have an overview of the very wide range of things that we do in our journal. So I may, and then sometimes, in fact, refer to another associate editor. Then it is my job to, once if we've decided against desk rejection, the heart and sort of the beating heart of peer review of interdisciplinary journal like ours is the quality of the subject specialist. Though I can assess the general scope and interest, I don't have the subject level skills and expertise. I usually find it quite easy to assign to subject specialists, but sometimes papers straddle two or more areas. So there may need to be a discussion amongst with me and a number of the AEs as to where it's appropriate, AEs or associate editors, and some issues that are within the scope of our journal actually may fall beyond the particular expertise of the team of associate editors that we have. So, for example, one of the issues that's been coming up recently is we're getting a few increasing number of submissions actually in the area of econometrics, and I want to acknowledge just with the slide as I talk all the associate editors and associate editor mentees that we have in our journal, but in fact, the field of econometrics, for example, although there are people who can look technically at the statistics and at the quality of those sorts of things, we don't have an economist, for example, or an econometrics person amongst our associate editors. So we then will have to make sure that we get the correct expertise in terms of shepherding this paper through and getting the correct people to do the peer review. And we're going to be hearing from one of our peer reviewers later. I have some other roles at the journal. I'm a lurker, so I keep track the peer review process, although I don't tend not to comment on it, but I watch as peer reviews come in. I'm supposed to contribute to the development of scientific publishing skills more generally. I have to represent the journal. I write editorials. I also contribute to, our journal's unusual in that we have a front section, which is not strictly speaking peer reviewed, certainly not in terms of the Department of Higher Education and Training subsidy system, but increasingly we are using a form of peer review even in this section, which I can talk about in the discussion. And it's really my role to depend on the expertise and advice of others, and especially on Dr. Fick, who is chairing, and the next person who's going to be speaking, who is Nadia Grobler. Thank you very much for your attention. And back to you, Linda.
Thank you, Leslie. Our next speaker, as Leslie mentioned, is Nadia Grobler. She is the Online Publishing Systems Administrator for the South African Journal of Science. And if her title sounds very technical and important, it's because it is very technical and important. Her area of expertise is scholarly publishing, systems, tools, and services. She studied information science at the University of Pretoria. And today she's going to give us a much more brief and simple version of all that she does for the journal, especially those aspects that relate to the peer review of submissions. Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you, Linda. Let me just share my screen. Okay, thank you. So, good morning to everyone that's listening in. So for this part, or my part of the presentation, I will be telling you a bit more about peer review from the perspective of the Online Publishing Systems Administrator. And for today's purpose, I will be zooming in a bit on the process of preparing a submission to go for anonymous peer review. So I would like to start off by just indicating that we only start the processing and preparation of a submission when we've actually agreed that the submission will be indeed going for review. So I will await that confirmation from the editor-in-chief and the associate editor. And the reason we do it this way is because as part of these preparations, we might perhaps request that certain outstanding information be submitted or some changes be made to the manuscript itself. So we would like to, let the authors know that if they do have to go through this, not extra trouble, but these extra work, it means their submission will still be going for review at the end of it. So it is worth the effort. And yes, so I've just tried to outline the basic steps in this regard. So the first step as part of the preparations, and I will be going into these in a bit more detail in the slides to follow. So the first step is that we check whether all the documentation or information has been submitted according to our author guidelines. We also check whether the manuscript adheres to our formatting guidelines. And after that, we go on to prepare the manuscript itself for review, and then also send it for a similarity check. And then lastly, once everything is in order, we assign that submission to an associate editor to send it out for review. And that's where Teresa will come in the next presentation. So as mentioned, the first step as part of the preparations is to check whether all the necessary documentation and information has been submitted, and also that the manuscript itself adheres to our formatting guidelines. So before I go into a bit more detail about what we look for, I just want to touch on the aspect of author guidelines in general. So these are there to generally expedites editorial processes, and this is for everyone involved in the process, everyone from the author to the reviewer to the editors themselves. But more than that, these things that we request or information that we request or ask that things be done in a certain way, it speaks to more than just that. It's also it also pertains to things such as openness and standardization. It might be necessary for interoperability between systems and indexing of content if your article gets published further down the line. So everything that we ask for or require does have serve a form of purpose. So it is important for authors to always be aware of the author guidelines and try to stick to these as far as possible, although in some cases, especially formatting, we do treat it with a case-by-case basis. And if some things can perhaps be attended to further down the line, then we won't waste unnecessary time to ask authors to fix those types of things. So yes, I just want to go through some of the things that we at the journal look at and just state why we ask for these types of documentation and information. So one of the first things we ask that be submitted is a publishing agreement. So this is important for obvious reasons, but it just confirms that all the authors have given consent for this article to undergo review and perhaps end up being published in our journal. And then it also confirms the author order in which authors will appear in the manuscript. We also request that a cover letter be submitted. So this, above and beyond just telling us about the relevance and the importance of the study, it also allows the author an opportunity to provide us with any declarations that they might have or conflict of interest. They can provide us with suggested reviewers and even opposed reviewers if perhaps that's the case. We also ask for a title page, which includes the titles, the main title, the running title, author and their affiliation details, keywords, ORC IDs, those types of things. So this is important for administrative purposes, but also in terms of things such as interoperability and indexing. It's important for us to have that type of information. We also look at the main document itself, and it is important that all the information that has to undergo review is included. So everything from figures and tables or supplementary material must be accompanied in the submission. We also request for our own purposes that a significance of the main findings statement be submitted. And we publish this to try and promote interest from a wider audience. We also ask that author contributions be submitted, and this is just in general for transparency, but also to give credit where credit is due and ensure accountability. And then lastly, we also ask that acknowledgements be submitted. So this can include important information such as funding, which we also need to be aware of. And then moving on to our formatting guidelines. As I mentioned earlier, in this area, we are sometimes a bit more lenient because some of the things can be attended to further down the line, but we do ask that authors try and adhere to these as far as possible in terms of fonts and spacing. And we also ask that an open file format be submitted for the manuscript itself, because we need to be able to edit that document accordingly, which I will be talking about a bit later in part of our preparations. We also look at referencing because we have a preferred referencing style, and also need to make sure that the referencing is complete within the manuscript itself. We also look at the figures and tables that are included. It's important that these are named appropriately, that captions are provided, acronyms, abbreviations where relevant. And then lastly, also very important for us, we do have certain length requirements for our various article types, so it's important that authors try and adhere to these as far as possible. So if everything is in order in terms of the documentation and information submitted and the format of the manuscript, we will move on to the next part of the process, which is preparing the manuscript to go for review and doing a similarity check. So as part of our preparations for the manuscript, we try and do it in a way that it is easy for reviewers to do the review. So we try to combine everything that pertains to the review into a single document. So that includes the body text, figures, tables, and any supplementary material that has been submitted. We also add line numbers to this final document. This would just expedite the process for a reviewer because they can pinpoint an exact place that they perhaps want to ask a question about or refer to something. And then for our own purposes, we make use of double-blind review. So it's important that we anonymize the manuscript accordingly. We do ask authors to do this as well, but sometimes if that has not been done, we would just check the metadata itself to make sure there isn't any author-related information there. And then also just read through the document, as sometimes there could be text that implicates the author's identity. So once we've prepared the manuscript for review, that final document will be sent for a similarity check. So with regards to similarity, we do deal with this on a case-by-case basis, and we open up the similarity report and go through it in its entirety. We don't just necessarily check the percentage, because that can sometimes be misleading. So if we do pick up any issues at this stage, we will refer to our plagiarism policy to deal with that. But in general, we refer to, just make sure that all the sources are appropriately cited, that has been picked up by the system, and also that proper paraphrasing is in order, because sometimes we would see that an author might perhaps cite a resource appropriately, but they would copy an entire paragraph or a large piece of text from that source, which is also not acceptable unless it's under very specific conditions. And just for interest as well, I think we've also seen a lot of self-plagiarism recently, and maybe not a lot of people might be aware of that. But it's always important, if you refer to some of your previous research or work or findings, that you also cite that accordingly. So then, if everything is good in terms of the similarity, we will move to the final step, and that is to actually assign the submission to an associate editor now to go for review. So this just basically entails moving the submission into the review stage on the system now. And then I will attach the file that we have prepared and sent for similarity. And then it will be assigned to the relevant associate editor. And I will try and include any important information that might be of interest to the associate editor at this stage. And then it is in the hands of the associate editor to take on the responsibility of managing the peer review process. And that's what Teresa will be talking to you a bit more about in the following presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Our next speaker is Professor Teresa Coutinho. I'm sure I mispronounced that. Sorry, Teresa. Teresa has been an associate editor with the South African Journal of Science in the field of agriculture and forestry since 2018. She graduated with a PhD from the University of KwaZulu-Natal and worked at the University of the Free State before joining the University of Pretoria, where she is now, and where she started a research program on plant pathogenic bacteria. First on plantation trees and later on fruit trees and vegetable crops. Her research interest is mainly on opportunistic plant pathogenic bacteria, that is bacteria that infect stressed plant hosts, and she currently is investigating the host jump of a bacterial pathogen. She did give me the name, but I'm not going to try and pronounce it, from sugarcane to eucalypts in KwaZulu-Natal. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you very much, Linda. For some reason, my camera is not working. It was working perfectly a little while ago, but it's no longer working now, and I sincerely apologize for that. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank the South African Journal of Science team for giving me this opportunity to share with you the exact role played by an associate editor of this distinguished South African journal. Right from the onset, I need to stress that without this team, which includes Leslie, Linda, and Nadia, my responsibility as an associate editor would be impossible to perform. So in the next slide, I will go through the process we use to assign reviewers to the manuscripts. So the first step in the process is that I will receive a notification from Nadia by email that I need to attend to a submission in my discipline, which is agriculture and forestry. So as you can imagine, this is very broad and includes topics that range from aquaculture to zoonotic animal diseases. I will then read the submission, not so much for reviewing purposes, but rather to assist me in selecting appropriate reviewers. In the next slide, authors are asked when they submit their manuscripts for the contact details of at least 3 potential reviewers who are knowledgeable in their field. What I find rather amazing, or rather interesting, is that these suggested reviewers rarely agree to review the manuscript. I then need to select additional reviewers, and I make use of either the journal's database or use Google Scholar for this purpose. In the latter case, I will set the parameters to include only articles published in the last 3 years, thus assuring that the email address of the potential reviewer is the most recent. I'm sorry, I have to ask Nadia to select the next slide. I couldn't share my screen for also some reason. So reviewers often may not respond to the invitation or decline to review the manuscript. In my opinion, not responding to an invitation or accepting to review the submission but never bothering to perform the task is extremely rude. As researchers, we have an obligation to review manuscripts as part of our service to the scientific community. So, next slide, Nadia. So once the review has been completed, we will receive an email notification from Nadia. I would then thank the reviewer and then assess the quality of the report. Ideally, to make a decision, I would prefer to receive 2 high-quality reports, i.e., those that not only comment on the editing errors, but on the appropriateness of the methodology, interpretation of the results, and discussion of these results in terms of what has previously been published. If any of these criteria are not met, I will need to find additional reviewers, and this prolongs the decision-making process. I would say that in the majority of cases, the review reports will reach the same conclusion. If not, I would need to assess the reports and decide the way forward. At this stage, I can request revisions or accept or reject the submission. Revisions of the submissions are more often than not requested. The authors need to respond to the reviewer's comments. In some cases, the revised submission may need to be returned to the original reviewers for further assessment. Thereafter, the submission is either accepted or rejected. If accepted, it is then sent for copy editing. Contributors of submissions often complain that the process I've described to you is very long. I find the most challenging part of my position as associate editor is finding reviewers that will accept the task of reviewing the submission. On occasion, I've had to contact 15 or more potential reviewers, and if I'm lucky, one will accept the task. It is very frustrating, but very rewarding when you get to tap the accept button. Thank you very much. Back to you, Linda.
Thank you, Teresa. That was one of my questions. What is the most challenging part? So you've answered it ahead of time. Our next speaker is Sydney. Dr. Sydney Moyo joined our team as an Associate Editor Mentee in the field of organismal biology in 2020. He investigates invertebrates, and for those of you who don't know what invertebrates are, they're animals like insects, spiders, and crabs. Together with biochemical techniques and mathematical models to reveal the connections between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems and how these connections are shaped by humans. Sydney enjoys reading scientific papers on organismal biology and human ecology, which is a very good thing because that's a very important part of the job of being an editor. Thank you, Sydney.
Thank you so much, Linda. Let me just go right ahead and share my screen. Okay, so I have the brilliant task of actually sharing what it means to be a mentee. And I'm just going to say it's really great because Teresa just presented, so pretty much she's kind of covered most of the things that I actually do. But if you really look at what I do is I assess submissions, I invite reviewers, and I also make decisions that help inform the authors, whether it's an acceptance or a decline, or if it's requesting revisions. So what I'm just going to try and do is try and step back a little bit and kind of answer the question of what is an associate editor mentee? what do they do? How do you become one? And also, what is the role of the associate editor mentee? Because you're an associate editor, but you're also a mentee. And then the last thing that I'm probably going to touch on is, my own personal musings of what it means to be an editor mentee. So the skills and lessons that you'd probably learn. Well, one of the things that I just thought that I would touch on is what is an associate editor mentee? Now, the word mentee can be a bit confusing in when we're talking about being an associate editor, because a mentee mentor relationship can sometimes be considered as being more hierarchical. But in this case, when you're an associate editor mentee, you're really more of a learning partner. So that's how I would define it. You're more of a learning partner, learning in the sense that there's a lot to learn. So when I started, I pretty much would click the wrong things, and sometimes it's very difficult to assess. Some papers will straddle different fields, and sometimes it's always very hard to kind of judge the quality. But at the same time, you're also a partner, right? So there's a lot to learn, but at the same time, you're also a partner in the sense that there's a certain level of equality with the actual associate editor, in the sense that, you also understand the subject area that you're all working in. And I also feel that in the same relationship, it's also very reciprocal, right? So in as much as you are learning from them, they are also learning from you, because you also have different expertise in different subjects, right? So an associate editor mentee is really a learning partner, and that's how it's actually viewed in my sense. So in terms of responsibilities, so your responsibilities, I think Nadia, Leslie, and Teresa have kind of gone through what our responsibilities are, but I've just kind of summarized them into 4, right? So you have responsibilities to the journal, but then that takes, 3 forms. You have responsibilities to the authors, and that kind of involves being a good communicator. Many times when authors realize that they've submitted a paper and it's been several months, they will send emails trying to find out. So communicate why there's a lag, and usually the lag is finding reviewers. So finding reviewers is always some of the biggest challenge. And also you have a responsibility to the reviewers themselves, and part of that involves being honest with them, communicating with them, and kind of telling them that, if they need extra time, and also being very accommodating, that's part of your responsibility. And also there's responsibility to the readers, and part of that responsibility takes the form of me ensuring that the quality that we for papers that we're recommending for publications are actually papers that are of the highest quality, that we actually also believe that will have a multidisciplinary approach. So the last thing that I'll probably then just touch on is, what are the skills and lessons that you gain as an associate editor, right? So obviously, as you've already figured, most of the work that we do really involves working in a team, right? And it kind of requires you to be really dependent on what other people do. So for example, I know very little about, the online publishing system in terms of the back end. But then you have a person like Nadia that really knows how to do it, right? So that kind of helps you. So you learn to have rapport with the people that you work with. Now, also, one of the things that I sometimes will check for, and usually will check for when reviewer comments come in, one of the things that you do as you are looking at them is also to make sure that they don't contain offensive words. So you also learn certain rules of social etiquette and also writing etiquette, right? So yes, reviewers are allowed to be critical, and they have to be critical, but the words should not be offensive. Also, one thing that you also start to learn is you also start to learn to listen and learn, right? And that's one of the things that you also learn from, not just from the associate editor, but you also learn from the reviewers themselves. Their view of a particular paper also makes you understand the trends in your field of specialty. So for example, a reviewer might say something as simple as, well, whilst this paper is great, I do not think that it will have as wide a readership because of this particular issue that you might not have been aware of. So one of the things that you really learn as an associate editor mentee is that there's a lot to learn. The other thing is also you learn more about the editorial process. And funny enough, by reading other papers and reading reviewer comments, I've not only become a better reviewer, but I've also become a better author. Because one of the things that you don't realize when you're an author is you're kind of in your own bubble, right? You write in your own bubble, and you seldom think about the things that the issues that you think are not issues are probably issues. So for example, being having extra lengthy papers that actually are not concise enough, it's things that you don't think about. But as you see reviewers always commenting about the length and how things could be expressed a little better, you start to realize that the editorial process actually makes you a better reviewer and an author. And one other thing that is really amazing is you also learn about new and exciting research. So it exposes you to current topics and topics that are of interest. So for example, sometimes you might not even think that there's there's an animal in the museum that still needs to be identified. Okay, so that's something that can be very, very interesting. And also there's this notion when you're an author and you're submitting papers that you feel that the editors are gatekeepers, right? And they're just trying to stop you from actually getting through the door. And that is seldom the process. You actually realize that they're actually architects that are trying to make sure that your work is successful. And the other thing that you learn is really patience. And I think Teresa touched on this, is really finding reviewers can be very, very difficult. And when reviewers don't respond, it can be actually very disheartening. So it's actually quite unfair. And what's always weird for me is if you are submitting papers as an author, you really owe it to the academic community to also do the same. And the last thing that I really think is amazing is you get to enjoy the role, right? It's not just an honor to be an associate editor, but it's also a privilege. It is a privilege that really promotes excellence in scholarship in your field. And I think that's what really makes it amazing. Awesome. So if you really want to become an associate editor mentee, one of the things that you need to do is just look online and apply. Thank you very much. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Sydney. It was very informative and very passionate. I'm so pleasing to hear someone speak so passionately about being an associate editor and the responsibilities that come with it. Our last speaker is Dr. Lungiswa Nkonke, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Global Health at Stellenbosch University. Her research interests include economic evaluation of healthcare interventions, and particularly the cost effectiveness of community-based interventions aimed at improving maternal, child, and adolescent health outcomes. She served as a panel member on the Competition Commission of South Africa's Private Healthcare Market Inquiry and worked as a specialist scientist at the Medical Research Council. She is an NRF-rated researcher, a member of the South African Young Academy of Science, and is on the editorial board of PLOS Global Public Health. She is also on the editorial advisory board of the South African Journal of Science, but today she'll be speaking to us from the perspective of a reviewer. Thank you, Geethwe.
Thank you, Linda, for the introduction, and good morning, colleagues. This morning, I am going to be speaking from the perspective of the reviewer. And I think I've taken to heart the theme of the peer review week, which is identity in peer review. And so I've really reflected on what is my experience as a peer reviewer and what motivates me to take on the role of being a peer reviewer for manuscripts. So I thought I'd start first with, why do I agree to peer review manuscripts? I think colleagues have already, pointed out to that it is a service to academia, because I'm also an academic and I write papers, and other peers review my work, and in many instances improve the quality of my work. I feel that it is my duty and my obligation to do the same to provide the same service for academia. So I think that's my sort of main underlying motivation for agreeing to be a peer reviewer for manuscripts. I think the other important motivation is that increasingly in academic institutions, it's seen as a sign of your national standing or international standing. So what do I mean by that? In many instances, in CVs, when people are being considered for promotions, you are asked to write about what is your national standing. And so if you're being asked to peer review nationally or internationally, it's a recognition of your work in that particular field. I think the associate editor spoke about what is the process they follow to choose reviewers. And she mentioned that she goes to Google Scholar and they would see who has written recently in that particular topic. So it is also an indication of one's national standing or international standing. So the next question for me is, should I agree to peer review this paper? So when I started off as a young academic, I didn't actually get many requests to review. In fact, my first assignment to peer review, I was invited by my mentor to co-review a paper that he had been asked to review. After that experience, when I started publishing my own work, then I got reviews. I got requests to peer review papers. And then I had to address the question of how do I choose which manuscript to agree to peer review or not. For me, there's two important things. One is I ask myself, is this in my thematic area? Is this in my field? I'm a health economist, but health economics is broad. The people who focus on health financing, the people who focus on economic evaluation. So it's very important also to think about, or do I have the methodological expertise to critically appraise this paper? And the third thing is I consider my time. I think the associate editors have spoken about the importance of the etiquette of responding on time. So I look at all my various tasks and I think about, would I be able to do a good job on this paper and have a relatively quick turnaround time? You don't want to sit with one paper for 3 months. And then finally, I think another important consideration for me as I grew in my career, I got more and more requests from different journals, is the question of who to peer review for. And here I don't sort of have a straight, a specific answer, but I have a number of things that I consider. So in any context, you would have a national journal. In this context, the South African Journal of Science is a national journal for me. And then there are other national journals that apply to my field. You will get regional journals. There are international journals. Journals have different impact factors. And so I try to get a balance in a year, as I think about the year in my work and I plan my work, I think about this year, I feel obliged that I must review work for a national journal and a regional journal. And I would also, if I get an international journal, I remember I mentioned previously that it can also be an indication of your international standing. So it does matter to me that I also review journals that are considered international journals. More recently, I've noticed some journals offer incentives for instance, a discount on publication costs if you peer review for them. So it might be a consideration for someone if they don't have funds if it is a journal they would like to publish in, but they might not have enough funds. But it's important to note that that doesn't guarantee that your paper would be accepted, but if it is accepted, then you could get a discount. Others might raise some ethical issues around that. Perhaps we can discuss that during the discussion time. So now I come to the structure of the report. If I have agreed to peer review for a journal, what is it that I actually do? Some journals have a checklist and a structured reporting format, which makes it easier actually for one to make sure that they have covered all the key essential areas. So they would ask specific questions like, you know, was the scope of this literature sufficient? And you have a section where you write your additional comments for the authors as well as for the editors. If there is no structured format, which is still largely the case for many journals, I write my own report. And what I focus on is that first I provide a comment on the importance of the topic. And I look at the scope of the literature. In other words, have the recent literature been cited? Did the article cover the most important literature in that field? I look at methodological rigor. I look at the key findings. And I have a practice that I value. So when I read a paper, I would read the results section and write my own conclusions without reading the author's discussion and conclusions. Because I think in Leslie's opening presentation, he also mentioned that it's important to ensure that the conclusions of the paper follow from the findings of that research. And I look at the interpretation of the findings, whether they are correct or, and for instance, if I'm a quantitative researcher, if the statistical findings are actually interpreted correctly. And then I look at the discussion and whether the authors have cited the main limitations of their study. When you've compiled your report, I think that it's very important to consider a few things. So on this slide, I have pointed out some recommended do's and don'ts. So first, I think we are all working with the incredible time constraints. And so it's important to write a concise report and provide a summary of the research and your overall impression upfront so that the editors, you make the job of the editors easy. They know before they go through your report, what's your overall impression of the paper. I think it's important to indicate what are major revisions and what are minor revisions for the authors as well. And it's important to provide constructive comments and be professional and respectful. I mean, at times, I think it's quite shocking what you can see written in review by peer reviewers. So I think it's always important to be mindful that the authors will read these comments and avoid saying things like, the authors have no idea what they're talking about. I don't think they read any literature at all. I think the ways of saying that there is important missing literature without being rude to the authors. I think it's important to state your own limitations. So if I've mentioned that I'm a health economist, and if you receive a paper and it's discussing, they applied labor economics techniques, and you're not a labor economist, you can review the paper, but be very specific that I couldn't assess this particular section, and I recommend that a labor economist is approached to look at this particular section of the paper. On the don'ts, don't accept a peer review if you will not have sufficient time to critically appraise the manuscript. I think it can be really disheartening. Now I'm switching my cap and speaking as an author as well, to see that the reviewer did not actually read your paper. So if you don't have enough time to critically appraise the manuscript, don't accept the request. I think most importantly, do not use the peer review process to promote your own work, and insist that the authors cite your work when it's not even relevant. Don't edit the manuscript. Some manuscripts, I think Leslie mentioned earlier on that we have authors that many people are writing in English, but English is not their first language. And so you can have a reasonable quality paper or a good work that's been done, but there's some serious language challenges. You can point out to the editor and to the authors that it requires editing, but I think that you shouldn't edit it yourself. Finally, do not request additional work that is out of the scope of the study or even out of the scope of the journal. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Lindy. So that was very informative, and I know there was some very useful tips there that will assist both reviewers and authors. We've come to the end of our panel presentation session, right on time, so well done to all the panel members for sticking to time. We now have a few minutes for a panel discussion, and I wonder if I could kick off the discussion by asking our panelists a question, and comes from Sydney's slide, which I really liked, about the responsibility that editors have towards authors, reviewers, as well as readers. And given that authors, reviewers, and readers generally would be the same community of academics or researchers, why do you think, and both Teresa and Sydney particularly mentioned this, it's such a challenge to find willing peer reviewers? Perhaps Sydney, you could start us off.
So I guess for what I personally, what I've found is, I think maybe people are busy, and that's one thing. But I think on the flip side, sometimes people see the email telling them that, oh, would you like to review? But in their head, they probably feel that they're unable to do it, but they probably just don't communicate it. But I think it primarily boils down to maybe people are very, very busy, or they feel that it might be taking time away from writing their own papers. So maybe the psychology is more of, if I review a paper, it takes time. I could be using that time to dedicate to my own paper, but they don't realize that it's also a vicious cycle, because at some point you're going to submit that same paper and also expect people to review that paper. But yeah, it baffles me sometimes. I have to be honest. It's very baffling at times.
Thanks, Vinny. I think that's true, and maybe it's up to all of us to remember that peer review works both ways. Do any of the other panel members want to add anything to Sydney's response?
Linda, my apologies. I had a problem and I had to get out of the Zoom and back into the Zoom, so I didn't hear the question.
Sorry, I was asking why the panelists think it is such a difficulty finding willing reviewers when the reviewer pool is essentially also the author and reader pool.
I didn't hear what Sydney said. My apologies for this. I think, this is very, it's certainly not just a South African question, but my experience, over having been a journal editor over many years, over 30 years, is that it's getting harder and harder. And I think that part of this has to do, and this may already have been mentioned, with the pattern of rewards for academics and researchers, where we try, and I don't know if this has been mentioned, but we're trying now to acknowledge peer review and so on and so forth. But in terms of people's careers, what is valued is obvious outputs rather than contributions to sustaining the academic community. And this is actually, it's bigger than just the issues that we're talking about today, but I think it's a major challenge, in fact, for the ongoing maintenance of peer review as a system. I don't think anybody has the answer for that. It's a very difficult one. Quite commonly, similarly, when I was doing work for the National Research Foundation in South Africa, people would prepare their material for rating, and you have to get reviewers to look at a number of articles that they've written and so on. And those same people who would have their submissions in for rating would say, I'm too busy to be a reviewer on somebody else's. So we need to develop a kind of system of reciprocity where it's part of the work. I would say for every article that I personally have, that I send into a journal for review, I have to do a review myself. Otherwise the system breaks down. Thanks, Lynn.
I think maybe those messages need to go a bit higher up the institutional ladder, and hopefully the situation will improve, but probably not in the short term. If anybody of the panelists have questions for the other panel members, please jump in. I don't want to hog all the questions, but while you're thinking, I did want to ask a simple question for all the panel members. If there was one piece of advice that you could give either to an author or reviewer to ensure a more successful peer review process, what would that be? Maybe we can start with Lungiswa as our reviewer representative.
Great. So I just want to paraphrase your question to make sure I got it correctly. So you asking what is one piece of advice that I would give to a reviewer to make the process efficient?
Either to the reviewer or the author,
okay.
to ensure a more successful process. Yes.
Okay, great. Let me start with the reviewer. I think I concluded with the slide on the do's and don'ts, and I'll sort of build from that. I think the key thing is to look at your time. So when you get that email that comes through and says we're requesting a review, read the title quickly, think, is this in my area of expertise? If yes, do I have the time? Can I give a report in 2 weeks? If not, if it's going to take me 3 weeks, what I usually do is I write back and say, I would like to review this paper, but I can only provide feedback on such and such a date. Will this be acceptable? Instead of saying, clicking accept and then miss the deadline and not communicate. And then I think going back to the previous question that was raised on, why do people not peer review anymore? I think in my second slide, I talked about the sort of incentives and the why for me. I think similarly to Leslie, I view it as a service to academia, that it is my job. So what I've started doing actually is planning in my work agreement, planning for peer review. And that last box that I have there on national standing, so I write in my work plan that in a year, I want to do X amount of reviews, and I want to do one every year. I want to do one for a national journal. I want to do one for a regional journal, and then an international journal, and then depending on the time. And so when the review comes, the request comes, you already have an idea of where you are in terms of that template. But also, I agree that the reviewer's job is not well recognized. But like I say, I write it on my work plan. I write it on my CV. But more importantly, I think that it's something that I must do as a reviewer, as a scientist. And then I would say, be constructive and respectful. It's important to critically appraise the work, but be constructive and respectful. And provide clear justifications for your comments. So you can provide evidence of, I think Nadia mentioned that the manuscript, they reformatted and provide line numbers. So instead of giving vague comments that the methodology is poor, what exactly is the challenge? Was the statistical test not done correctly? You can refer to tables so that you make it clear for the editor as well as for the authors what the challenges are with their manuscript. Then, do I still have time? I don't want to. So I will rely on you, Linda, to say if I should. I've spoken from the perspective of the review. I don't know if you want to give a chance to others, then I can come back and talk from a perspective of an author.
Thanks, Lungisa. That was a few more than one, but I think that was very helpful.
Yes.
I hope that other members of the audience share your attitude, and I'd be interested to hear their comments later. Would anybody else like to respond with me?
So I have a comment about for the author. So it is unreasonable for an author to wait 6 months for a peer review of their manuscripts, but occasionally it's really, really hard to find reviewers to accept the review, to do the review. So I've got a case where I think the manuscript is over 6 months and I just cannot find a reviewer to review the submission. Also, with regards to why reviewers decline to review manuscripts, is probably due to reviewer fatigue, because most of the reviewers I approach are international reviewers. I do try South Africans as well, obviously. And, you know, they probably get so many reviews to do that they have to be quite selective in what they want to review. So that's also a problem. But for an author, just be patient. We try on our best. Back to you, Linda.
Thanks, Teresa.
Should I carry on, Linda? Yeah, thank you. There are quite a few things here. Yeah, I completely agree about, you know, you send something to a journal and then you wait months, and the fantasy always is they don't like it or they're not doing anything, and we're sort of scrabbling around, you know, trying to find reviewers and so on behind the scenes. There's no harm in asking politely what's happened about a manuscript. We will always look at that. But I wanted to mention something which is actually not formally there, but I was thinking about as people were talking, and it may seem really odd, and it was partly addressed in Nadia's presentation. My advice for authors is read the website, read what the requirements are. I, as editor-in-chief, I get emails, you know, every day, and I'm always happy to answer queries, but I get many emails asking me questions which are the answer to which is completely obvious. If you just bother to I'm sounding irritated. Sorry, I shouldn't be. I'm supposed to be this calm. No, Lungiswa, I'm doing exactly what you said I shouldn't do. But part of why I'm sort of revealing this sort of level of irritation that we feel is I can't quantify this, and obviously I personally am aware of this and try not to let it influence things. But impression management, all of anybody in the audience who's ever taught students will know that we're interested in the content, but if something gets sent to us that's very messy, we will often get submissions which are in track changes format with comments all over from various authors and so on. And it creates, you know, before it gets to the formality of peer review, it creates a kind of impression. If you haven't done your homework, if you haven't looked at the journal, if you haven't done those sorts of things, and it's hard to quantify, but I would imagine that would affect how with the best one in the world, people who are assessing your manuscript are going to correspond and react to you. So, I mean, this is partly I'm saying this, you know, please be kind to us, but I actually think it's self-serving to be nice to the journal as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. Anybody? Sydney, Nadia? I think you.
No, I think Leslie said what I wanted to say. It's just read the author guidelines, and it might just save you some trouble along the way. And maybe just to comment on, I mean, I'm not a researcher myself. I don't do reviews and those types of things, but I have noticed it's really helpful if perhaps you are an expert in that field, that you can, and you don't have the time to do the review, that you can give suggested reviewers. You know, you can decline, but just give some further suggested reviewers for the associate editor. That will just give them a better starting point and save some time, and they can just go ahead and look at those reviews. So yeah, if you decline and you don't have the time, that's fine, but perhaps just give a few suggestions. That would also go a long way.
And I think also, Nadia, you would agree it's much preferable to just say, sorry, I can't do it, than to just not respond at all. Sydney, anything to add?
Well, I guess for me, it's Yeah, I think Leslie kind of touched on it. Just try and be concise too when you submit papers, and make sure that you follow the instructions. Because you're right, if you're looking at 20 or 30 papers, and there's a paper that's really messy and is not written, is lengthy, has many typos, many grammatical errors, it's very easy to miss the scientific message. So sometimes some papers are just simply rejected because the meaning is lost.
I think that, yeah, that's a very common and unfortunate situation that the potential or paper with potential isn't seen for what it could be. I don't know if any of the panel members have any questions for the other panel members. We've got a few more minutes, or we can go straight on to our questions.
I'll maybe just mention one other issue, which about I guess it was so right to mention this issue of etiquette, and it's very difficult for us to send rude reviews essentially to our authors. Similarly, and I don't think this has been mentioned. I hope it might have been mentioned while I had internet problems, but it is our job to send responses from authors back to reviewers, and reviewers, as we've heard, are doing us this huge favor. They're too busy and so on and so forth. They're helping us often very late at night, really, helping the journal out and helping the authors out. And sometimes authors are very rude to reviewers, which places the journal in a very difficult position, because it's not our job to shield our reviewers from the responses from authors, but it does make our lives very difficult. So it is absolutely acceptable as an author to indicate clearly why, with evidence, you disagree with the reviewer. That's in the nature. I mean, it's peer review. I mean, it's in the nature of the process. But just as we do not want our reviewers to be rude and destructive towards authors, we would rather that our authors were not rude and destructive towards their reviewers. It places the editorial team in a very difficult position. Thanks, Linda.
Thanks, Liz. There was actually a question related to that in the Q&A, so I'm going to jump straight ahead and try and find that question again. I think the question was, while I'm looking, pertained more to, here it is from Sheldon. As an associate editor, if you receive a review that contains offensive language, and do you edit that out before sending the review to the author? And more generally, if a review contains typographical errors, do you correct those? Perhaps Teresa or Sydney or Leslie, who would like to
Possibly I can start. I mean, I think that Teresa and Sydney would be better placed than me, but just to get.
Sorry, Leslie, you're quite soft.
Am I? Sorry, it's your. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Generally speaking, my own position is that it is not my job as an editor to interfere in any way with the flow of information from peers to one another. So I don't like to edit anything that comes from reviewers, but I have done in the past. And I mean, one of the things which, one of the don'ts that Lungiswa mentions is if I see clearly that a reviewer, not on this journal, but on another journal that I work on, I got a review where the only comments, and they were very detailed, were about, you know, cite me, essentially the reviewer was saying, when the paper had actually nothing to do with any of those articles, then I don't say, I'll make an editorial decision. I will not send that. I'll get another review. So I won't send that out at all. I generally don't correct typos. I might edit a little bit for tone, but I think, you know, part of the problem with editing for tone is we don't want to discourage robust debate. So I have on occasion gone back to reviewers and said, look, you've put this way. I would like to put it to the author in such and such a way. And generally the reviewers will agree to that. But I'm not sure what Sydney and Teresa feel about this.
Personally, I never correct typos. Like if it's typos, I just leave them as they are. And I guess usually if it's not clear, authors will usually also respond to the lack of clarity, and we can kind of deal with it when it comes to that point.
I also do not correct typographical errors. I just send the review as it is.
Thank you. There's been a few questions on how to become an editor mentee, and I think Nadia has shared the link to our Associate Editor Mentee program in the chat box. So if there's anyone interested in knowing more about our program, you can find the information on our website. Alan asks, how many hours per week do you think an associate editor will have to put into the journal and processes? Teresa,
well, that depends on the number of submissions, but generally I usually have between 5 and 10 at any one time. I think forestry and agriculture seems to be quite a popular topic. So it usually takes me a morning a week, I'd say, to go through them and do what I have to do.
Yeah, I think you know, we have 10 associate editors or 10 associate editor portfolios, and the number of submissions in each does vary quite a bit. So it does depend on the particular journal and the number of submissions that journal receives, I think. And also, you know, not every submission is the same. Some can take a lot longer than others. There's another question pertaining to how universal are editorial processes. Leslie, can you address that?
It's such an interesting question. How universal are editorial processes? It's a really good question. I'll speak from my own experience. I'm, you know, obviously editor-in-chief of this journal, and I work on a number of other, and have worked African and international journals. I think there's the general principles that we've been speaking about today, I think apply more or less across the board. But there are, and this is a very helpful thing for I think for authors to know, that there are very different conventions in different journals. So there are many journals, for example, that deal with the social sciences simply won't accept particular kinds of methodologies, even if it's not explicitly said on their website. There's been a lot of debate within the health science journals, and specifically in the British Medical Journal in the past few years, about the value or otherwise, for example, of qualitative research, which many people say is of no use at all, and other people argue is very important. I mean, in our journal, I just want to say we're quite open about these things. So I think it differs quite a lot from discipline to discipline. And I think one of the challenges of being a multidisciplinary journal is that we have to consider, I suppose, what the universal things are, because we want the content of our journal to be as accessible as possible for people across the board. So there's some, styles of things that I have written that are really quite sort of way out from a neuroscience point of view, autoethnographic, using poetry, those sorts of things, which I think are absolutely fine in certain kinds of journals, but it would not be acceptable in a journal like ours. So I think the finding what the disciplinary conventions are is very important, but then also it's an editorial requirement to help develop those conventions further, to question them, to look at the edges of them. And we face this, I mean, currently it's something that I mentioned in my talk. The criteria by which we judge scientific review articles are changing quite rapidly with the advent of systematic reviews and the explosion of interest. So our criteria may change over time as methodological conventions change over time. It was a bit long-winded, Linda.
Thank you, Lizzie. I think it was a question that asked a lot of questions in one. There's a question in the chat box regarding resources to help a novice reviewer. And then there's also a comment from Alan saying he asks peer reviewers to work with postgrad students in order to help teach them. So perhaps we can address how can you learn to become a peer reviewer?
So we have a journal club where we assess and discuss a paper every single week. And in that way, students learn how to review papers.
That's a really, really nice approach.
There are a number of the big publishers do have online guidelines for peer reviewing, and we have, and maybe when we send out the materials from this meeting, I don't have it in front of me at the moment, but there is an open access site which has training for how to do academic writing and so on. It actually has quite good guidelines for becoming a peer reviewer, and we have the link somewhere, and we can actually send it out with the material. I think Teresa's the kind of apprentice model, the ideal is a kind of apprentice model, either in a group or one-to-one, where senior academics who do a lot of reviewing see it as part of their responsibility to take on graduate students and new academics and sort of mentor them through. I mean, we have a formal mentoring system on the journal is a good one. You always have to bear in mind, if you get asked as a reviewer to review, whether it is within the requirements of that journal, whether that journal will permit you to show, because you sign a confidentiality agreement, to show your review to a graduate student. So always, ask the journal, ask us if it's not clear, please can I co-review with my graduate student? But we have to build up and develop a cohort of new reviewers. Yeah, thanks.
There's a question from Lizette, which Longiso is going to answer regarding the pros and cons of structured reviewers' forms.
I think it helps I think it helps us as associate editors to gauge the quality of the manuscript, but also often what they say in the tick boxes does not correspond to what they say in the review. So that's a major problem. Then you need to find another reviewer or look at the second review report.
Yes, I've never understood why that happens. Lungiswa, did you have anything to add?
Lungiswa, your mic. Can everyone else hear?
No.
Oh, okay.
I can't hear it.
Otherwise, you can answer the question in the Q&A maybe. I think I've found that it's useful to have a sort of a combination of structured and unstructured, because some people tend to be very brief, and then at least you have the sort of structured multiple choice type questions to give you some idea, but then also to give the option of them adding any other comments in a comments box. There's always going to be people who prefer the quicker multiple choice, and those that prefer to write a long story. And I find if you at least have both options, then you please most of the people some of the time. Let's.
I'm delighted what Linguiswa has to say.
Oh dear.
Linguiswa, maybe if you just type.
At the wrong moment.
Yeah.
Perhaps we can come back to that question. Hopefully we can get Linguiswa's audio back. There's a question from Chris, probably for Teresa or Sydney, regarding author-suggested peer reviewers, and does using author-suggested peer reviewers not deter the impartiality of the review?
So occasionally, we will get the reviewers. The author will suggest reviewers in the same institution, which I then do not use. I'd rather ask somebody else. But generally, they're quite good at selecting reviewers that would be impartial to the review process. So I've never had a problem selecting the review. Well, I do. I have had problems when all three reviewers are from the same institution or even the same department. But generally, they're quite good at selecting appropriate reviewers. So I don't have a problem with that.
That's encouraging.
And I haven't had a problem with that either. And I mean, one way of thinking about it is the only way that there's so many reviewers that you could probably approach. So at least giving a suggestion at least helps us to at least narrow that down. But it's actually not impartial, because we actually choose the ones we're going to invite from the list that you suggest, right? So we're not taking your suggestions, all of your suggestions. Sometimes we might not even use any of your suggestions, especially for fields that we already know reviewers that are able to assess your manuscript.
Also, I find it fascinating that if you use the reviewer suggested, oftentimes they won't accept the invitation. Most times they won't accept the invitation, which I find really strange.
Anybody want to add anything?
No? If I can just emphasize that it's the AE and the mentee decision who they're going to approach. So these are suggestions, and I mean, Teresa's mentioned when it's in the same institution, it's usually pretty clear. I mean, I've had experience being an AE on another journal somebody clearly, you know, suggesting their friends as reviewers, people with no subject knowledge, it's still up to us to do our due diligence when we're appointing reviewers. So this person's been suggested, then we'll go through the similar sort of processes, you know, that Teresa spoke about. Check what they, you know, what are they publishing on, and so on. We will do that even when we have these suggestions. We don't just take suggestions from authors. But I also want to emphasize this, what Sydney and Teresa said, is that most authors, just like most reviewers, I think most people are nice and ethical and won't give us inappropriate suggestions. And so it's often very helpful.
We have a question regarding responses from or comments from a reviewer, and how do you respond as an author if the comments show that the reviewer did not read and understand the manuscript because they're asking for information that is already included? How do you respond to that?
I will exclude the review and ask another reviewer.
Well, I think the person's asking from the perspective of an author. As an author, how would you respond? If the associate editor didn't do the exclusion they should have done.
Oh. I think in their response to the reviewer, they'd clarify exactly, well, mention it. It looks like you didn't read the flipping manuscript.
I mean, as my colleagues will know, we run other workshops on how to publish, and one of the things that I do is how to deal with peer reviews. I think it's almost inevitable. Just, you know, if a reviewer hasn't read anything at all, that's terrible. But reviewers will make mistakes. They'll miss things. They're busy, and so on. I mean, generally, what I suggest is what Teresa suggests, but using probably the approach that's been mentioned by Lungiswa. So I always think as an author, you have to remember who holds the power, and the reviewer holds the power. You don't, as the author. And often what I suggest is when reviewers have missed things, what I do as an author is I say, you will now find it on page so-and-so of the manuscript, you know, and I tend not to say it was there all along, you didn't read me properly. So in a very tactful way, I will point out, you know, what the reviewer is looking for if they say something is not there. And I think, you know, similarly, if one is going to, it's fine to disagree with a reviewer, but then you would need to be very clear about why you disagree and why you haven't made a change. You'd have to make a very clear argument for that, and that'll be considered by the associate editor or the editor. Yeah, thanks.
There's a question for an editor-in-chief in terms of what level of explanatory feedback do you give authors of desk-rejected submissions?
That's a good question. We usually, the short answer is not as much as we'd like, just because of pressure on the journal. So there's a resource question there. Generally speaking, we try and indicate to authors of desk-rejected manuscripts the reasons why we are desk rejecting, but we are not, desk rejection is not the same as doing a full peer review, because we are not reviewers. I mean, we're not anonymous, and so on. So the categories are often, you know, quite small. In my experience, the most common, and they're quite easy to say, you know, this doesn't fall within our scope geographically, or this is unlikely to be of multidisciplinary interest. where I know of other journals, I may suggest, you know, have you thought about this other one or this subject specific journal? But you can't, with a desk projection is not the same as a full peer review process, unfortunately.
Thank you, Leslie. I don't think we've been able to fix Lungiswa's audio, but
Yeah,
he has...
It's still not yet.
No, I can hear you.
Okay,
Sorry.
great. I took out the earphones. I'm not sure what's the issue. Yay! Great, thanks.
So you were going to answer the question regarding structured reviews.
Yes. So I think the advantage of a structured review is that when they are comprehensive, they ensure that you look at all the different sections of the papers. But like many checklists, the main limitation is that they don't allow you to capture complexity. So you could have a paper that the method section is done very well, but there are some limitations. And now this is where you see the discrepancy between clicking yes, and then you have some important comments around the methodology. And the other, sometimes there are contradictions within the paper, and that you do need to point out, and they're not actually captured in the checklist. I would say that the main advantage for me is that it does serve as a guide, that you look at the introduction, you look at the literature, at the methods of the analysis, but you could have a paper that has a very strong methods, but those methods haven't been carried through well in the analysis. And so now you're ticking, yes, the methodology is great, but the analysis, And I wanted to comment on the conversation about improving about mentoring novice reviewers, or I think it was mentioned in the discussion that you should ask the journal if you can share the paper, you can co-review with someone. But I also think that you can also ask if you can disclose who you co-reviewed with. And I think that it is a nice sort of confidence booster for the novice reviewer to be able to say, I have co-reviewed with so-and-so. And if they're not acknowledged in that review, then they can't really say that because there's no evidence of that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Lungiswa. I'm glad we were able to get you back for that answer. There's a few questions relating to ethical considerations regarding giving reviewers discounts on article processing charges or compensating reviewers in some way, and also on the usefulness of reviewer recognition tools or services like reviewer credit or Publons. Leslie, would you like to?
As you know, Linda, we're starting to experiment with recognition for reviewers in some form for our journal, and I'm hoping that this develops, because this is part of the hidden work of keeping the science community going, and it's absolutely crucial. And it's as we've all said, it's getting more and more difficult. It's part of why we have peer review week. In fact, the question about the ethics of for example, discounts on APCs. I mean, our journal is in the lucky position where we have a government grant and we are open access, but we do not have to charge for page fees, which is, like you said, doesn't apply to us. But I suppose it's analogous. I mean, in my professional capacity, I sometimes give expert opinion for the courts, and I always say, because invariably, if it's a dispute, I get called by one side or another, and I do charge as a professional. I'm being charged not for the outcome of my opinion, but for the expertise in coming to that opinion. So if there are incentives like publons or discounts, or some publishers now will give you, and I'm terrible, I'm a sort of bookaholic, and I think, oh, if I review for this journal, I'm going to get 50% off for a favorite book I've wanted, and so on. That is not, I am not being paid for the outcome of my review. I am being paid for my expertise, or I'm being compensated in some way for my expertise. I suppose, just like with everything else, there could be very perverse incentives, because you could get, then reviewers who will do very perfunctory, the kind of review that Lungus was, mentioned, where you say, this isn't good enough, or the argument was bad, or I disagree with the statistics, without giving any kind of examples, and then you still get your discount. But I don't think most people would do that. So I have never heard of a situation where where reviewers have been incentivized in any way to come up with any particular opinion. That would be a problem. But that's not what we're trying to find ways, all journalists are trying to find ways to get competent people to give good quality reviews which are supportive as quickly as possible, and all journals are struggling with that. So these are all ways that journals are trying, but nobody is paying people for the outcome of their opinion, as far as I know. They shouldn't be. Thanks, Linda.
Thanks, Leslie. Does anyone want to add their view on that?
Yes, I think I would agree with that, and would caution reviewers not to accept assignments because they have an intention of publishing in that journal, because the perverse incentive there would be, I think I discussed in my criteria, that you need to look at what your thematic area is, whether you have the expertise to actually do a good job. And so it has happened to me recently that I was thinking of submitting a paper to a particular journal, and it is a challenge in particular for scientists who are in the global south to raise funds for these publication charges. And then I received a request to review for this journal, and I thought, let me apply my usual criteria. Is this in my thematic area? Can I do it well? No, it wasn't. Even though I do have an intention of publishing there, I shouldn't do this review. And I think that is will become very important in the context of incentives. If you are aligned, the request you receive is within your area of expertise, and it is one of the journals you would like to publish on, then I don't see any harm. And I think, as Leslie pointed out, you're not being compensated for the outcome, but for the effort and the work. And in my looking at the different discounts, I haven't seen any discount that's more than 40%. It's usually ranging between 10 and 25%.
Thanks, Randiswa. I think, yeah, it's not necessarily an unethical situation, but it may put under-resourced journals versus, big publisher journals at a disadvantage if peer review becomes more of a pay-for service than a reciprocal service. Yeah. We have a question from Anya regarding how is it, if the publishing process, including peer review, is extensive, how is it that unethical or methodologically unsound papers can still be published? I think peer review is not a perfect system. I'm not sure which of our panel members would like to respond first.
I think you saw, if it's really out of your field of expertise, you are totally dependent on the reviewer's opinion. And if your reviewers weren't appropriate or you know, you really depend on that review report to make a decision. And sometimes they do slip through that they aren't that good. It's just part of the process.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, you know, there's going to be human error in everything. We do our best. I would imagine that the particular journal that Anya's referring to would have you know, really done an audit and had a look at what happened, but mistakes happen. And also that's part of the nature of the academy. So, you know, things slip through, and that probably shouldn't, but often those are incredibly useful in the bigger picture of advancing science, advancing ethical practices. I mean, the particular example that Anya was referring to, it was terrible. I mean, I can't imagine, I mean, sitting in the comfort of where I am, how that got published in a good journal and so on and so forth. The other side is that as a result of it, it exposed a whole lot of other things and led to a whole lot of other practices. So I suppose I'm being a bit of a kind of Pollyanna, but it's imperfect, and mistakes properly dealt with within the academy, which will happen in science, are part of the development of science as well.
I think it's a process that improves on the submission but doesn't make it perfect, because nothing can ever be perfect. A question from Francois regarding academic supervisors, and what do you do if an academic supervisor publishes with a postgraduate student, and if the supervisor claims the first authorship?
Okay, I'd like to tackle that one. So at UP, we have a memorandum of understanding with our students, which we both sign. And the students are given 2 years to publish as first author on their thesis chapters. After that, the advisor can claim first authorship. So as a student, you need to understand or have a discussion with your advisor on what's going on, how the authorship works on scientific papers. But that's how we do it here, and it works well.
I think similarly at Stellenbosch University, in the Department of Global Health, we have a similar process. We would have a memorandum of understanding, and our students are meant to be first authors. But I think, as Teresa has pointed out, it does happen that a student is part of a bigger project, and there is a timeline to the outputs of that project. And if the student is unable or unwilling, for whatever reason, to take the research through a manuscript process. So I think one needs to decide, you can do the research and you produce a dissertation, and there is a lack of time. So if you're working within a bigger project and it's a project that's funded, then the PI of that project does need to meet the deliverables. And if one of the deliverables were publications, if the student is unwilling or unable, then the deliverable still needs to be met. And I think in those cases, the ethical thing to do would be to acknowledge the student that this was done by so-and-so and submitted as a dissertation, and that became a manuscript that was now authored by somebody else.
If I can talk quickly, because I've just realized that the electricity is off in our area and my battery may be going. So, you know, this is a big topic, the who claims authorship and so on. And I mean, if people are interested, I've done some research on this and would be happy to share material on it. But I mean, the fundamental principle, I think, with this is that it should be contracted before any student starts. You know, authorship disputes are much more difficult to deal with once they've happened than in principle. So if the principles, and you know, I guess was mentioned, and so it's Teresa, that there are these contracts. These contracts are very important. That the principles are discussed in advance as possible. Sorry, I was just jumping in because I may not have time. Yeah.
Thank you, Leslie. I think we are running out of time for questions. There was one question which was answered. So just for the benefit of the others, Lizette asked what percentage for similarity is acceptable. And Leslie did respond that, you know, there's not one particular percentage that is the make or break. We look at every Authenticate report on a case-to-case basis and investigate where the similarity is, and not just at the overall percentage amount. So I think we have answered all of the questions, and it just remains for me to thank all of the panelists for their presentations as well as their informative answers. I think I've learned something as well today. So thank you very much, and thank you for the participants for attending and for all your questions. And I hope that you've learned something as well. There's obviously peer review is a huge topic, and there's always more to discuss. And as things change and evolve, there will be more topics to hopefully present on and get everybody's thoughts and opinions on. I would like to ask you, please, before we go, and I had these slides which I've totally forgotten to share, because I can't talk and share at the same time, I'm sorry. But never mind. I just want to ask if panelists will please complete a short poll so that we can get your peer review of our webinar. And thank you once again. There is in the chat box a link to other peer review activities for those who are interested. We'll just give you a few minutes to complete the poll, and once you've done that, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. And on behalf of the panelists, can I thank Linda and everyone for sharing so well. Thank you very much for keeping us on track. Thank you.